For decades, Union Pacific's Big Boy has won the crown of American steam without contest. Its 135,375 pounds of tractive effort, its 132-foot frame, its myth, all treated as settled, final, untouchable. But buried in the builder records of a Virginia machine shop, a different number exists: 152,206 pounds. A figure that exceeds Big Boy by more than 17,000 pounds of pulling force, stamped on an official specification sheet for a locomotive almost no one remembers. If raw tractive effort determines the king of steam, then the throne belongs to a machine that almost no museum displays and almost no textbook names. How did the most powerful steam locomotive by one of railroading's most critical measures simply vanish from the story? The answer reveals how history is written. Not in test logs, but in publicity campaigns, preservation budgets, and the silence of scrapping yards. Union Pacific's Big Boy stands as the canonical benchmark of American industrial ambition. Built by the American Locomotive Company between 1941 and 1944, all 25 units were designed around a single uncompromising demand: haul freight over the voyage range without helper engines, without stalling, and without mercy to the grade. The 4884 wheel arrangement distributed more than 540,000 pounds across 16 driving wheels. The boiler, pressurized to 300 pounds per square inch, drove 4 cylinders to produce a sustained drawbar output, confirmed at 6,290 horsepower in official tests. At 135,375 pounds of tractive effort, it could start trains weighing 3,600 tons and keep them moving up inclines that had humbled every previous design. 8 of these locomotives survive today. Number 4, 2014, restored to operational condition by Union Pacific, draws crowds that line the tracks for miles in every direction. The Big Boy has appeared on commemorative postage stamps, in children's books, and in museum exhibits from Dallas to Cheyenne. Its legend is self-reinforcing. Each generation encounters the name and accepts it as the final word. In every ranking, every documentary, and every casual conversation about great machines, Big Boy rises to the top without argument. The benchmark appears settled. The question of supremacy appears closed. The archives suggest otherwise. In the railroad yards of Roanoke, Virginia, the Norfolk and Western Railway operated something that most of America never noticed. While Union Pacific publicized its giants across the high plains and mountain passes of the West, Norfolk and Western built its own locomotives in-house, in its own shops, for its own mountains, and measured success not in headlines, but in coal tonnage delivered per operating dollar. The machine that emerged from that philosophy was the Y6b, a 2882 compound articulated locomotive, and the final evolution of a design lineage that Norfolk and Western had been refining since 1918. The Y6b entered service in 1948. Its specifications, preserved in builder documents held by the Virginia Museum of Transportation, tell a story that the broader public never heard. Starting tractive effort reached 126,838 pounds from the engine alone. Add the trailing booster, a supplemental steam-driven axle activated for slow-speed starts, and the figure climbed to 152,206 pounds of force at the rail. That number is not a projection or a marketing claim. It is a calculated rating derived from cylinder dimensions, boiler pressure, and wheel diameter, the same methodology used to derive Big Boy's published figure. The Y6b's advantage was not marginal, it was structural, built into the machine's fundamental geometry. Norfolk and Western's Roanoke Shops produced the Y6b entirely from their own engineering staff, their own foundry, and their own assembly floor. No outside builder, no contracted design team. The railroad that ran the locomotive also designed and built it, which meant that every specification reflected operational experience rather than sales ambition. To understand what 152,206 pounds of tractive effort actually means, the underlying mechanics demand examination. Tractive effort is the force a locomotive applies at the rail to initiate movement. It is calculated from boiler pressure, cylinder bore, piston stroke, and driving wheel diameter. Higher values mean the ability to start heavier trains, to overcome inertia on grades, to hold tonnage against a slope without slipping. In the coal fields of Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky, where grades were relentless and trains were long, starting tractive effort was not an abstract figure. It was the difference between a train that moved and a train that stalled. The Y6b achieved its advantage through compound expansion, a two-stage steam cycle that the Norfolk and Western had mastered over 3 decades. High-pressure steam from the boiler first entered a pair of small-bore cylinders, extracting the initial burst of energy. The exhaust from those cylinders, still carrying significant pressure, was then routed into a second pair of larger low-pressure cylinders, where the remaining energy was converted into additional tractive force. This compound arrangement extracted more work from each pound of coal than a simple expansion engine could achieve. On paper, it reduced fuel consumption. In the coal country of the southern Appalachians, where the railroad owned its own mines and supplied its own fuel, that efficiency carried direct financial weight. Big Boy, by contrast, used simple expansion, 4 cylinders operating on fresh high-pressure steam from the boiler each stroke. The design prioritized sustained horsepower at speed over maximum starting force. Both philosophies were legitimate. Both were optimized for their respective routes, but when the single metric of starting tractive effort is applied to both locomotives side by side, the Y6b's number stands above Big Boy's by a margin that cannot be dismissed as rounding error. The Appalachian coal fields of the mid-20th century operated under a logic as unforgiving as the terrain itself. Wartime production demands had pushed American coal output to historic levels, and the railroads threading through West Virginia, Kentucky, and Virginia carried the weight of an entire industrial economy on their rails. Norfolk and Western's main line crossed grades that could reach 1.4%, steep enough to reduce a lesser locomotive to a crawl. Trains loaded with coal stretched for a mile or more, and the difference between a locomotive that could start from a standstill on grade and one that could not was the difference between a functioning railroad and gridlock. The Y6b was engineered precisely for this environment. Its 2-engine articulated frame, joined by a hinge that allowed the locomotive to navigate curves that would bind a rigid machine, spread the locomotive's 500,000-pound weight across 16 driving axles. This distribution kept the load on any single axle within the tolerance of Norfolk and Western's track. The compound cylinders, running at 300 pounds of boiler pressure, produced a starting effort that the railroad's own operational records confirmed in service, not just on a test stand. Train dispatcher logs from the 1950s, preserved at the Norfolk and Western Historical Society, document Y6b locomotives starting trains of 5,000 tons and above from coal standing, starts on ruling grades without assistance. Norfolk and Western's chief mechanical engineer, Elvin T. Strickland, described the Y6b's design philosophy in internal correspondence from 1947 as the product of 30 years of compound experience distilled into a single machine. Where other railroads had abandoned compound steam in favor of simpler maintenance, Norfolk and Western had continued to refine it. The result, Strickland wrote, was a locomotive whose operating economy was unmatched on any coal hauling route in North America. The Y6b's performance was not theoretical. The dynamometer records held by the Norfolk and Western Historical Society document sustained drawbar pull exceeding 120,000 pounds at low speeds, consistent across multiple test runs conducted between 1948 and 1952. Fuel consumption figures from those same records show a compound advantage, where a simple expansion locomotive of comparable size burned through coal at a rate reflecting the energy abandoned in each exhaust stroke. The Y6b's second-stage cylinders captured that energy and converted it into forward motion. Operating cost analysis from the period, compared against Norfolk and Western's own diesel units as they began arriving in the early 1950s, showed the Y6b holding its own in cost per ton-mile on heavy coal service more effectively than any other steam class on the property. The locomotive's construction by the Roanoke Shops introduced a further variable that no outside builder's product could match: institutional knowledge. Mechanical department foremen who maintained the Y6IE had, in many cases, helped build it. They understood its compound steam circuits, its articulation points, its valve timing, and its idiosyncrasies at a level that translated directly into shorter repair times and higher availability rates. Shop records from the early 1950s show the Y6b class averaging over 22,000 miles of service per month per locomotive, a figure that matched or exceeded the availability of Norfolk and Western's incoming diesel units in the same period. This was the paradox that the railroad's own internal reports documented in careful language. The Y6b, by every operational measure available, was competitive. Its fuel costs were manageable, its maintenance was understood, its performance on the grades it was designed to conquer was not merely adequate, it was superior to any alternative the market offered for that specific task. The end came not from mechanical failure, but from a boardroom calculation made in an era when the word diesel carried the weight of inevitability. In 1955, Norfolk and Western's Board of Directors authorized the dieselization study. The document that resulted, now accessible through the Virginia Museum of Transportation's archival collection, laid out the economics in columns of comparative figures. Diesel locomotives offered lower fuel cost per unit, reduced crew requirements, and the ability to run multiple units in a single consist controlled by one engineer. Maintenance, though significant, followed a standardized protocol supported by manufacturer representatives and a nationwide supply chain. The compound steam cycle, however efficient on coal, required expertise that was concentrated in Roanoke and aging with every retirement from the mechanical department. By 1958, Norfolk and Western's leadership had committed to full dieselization. The Y6b class, 30 locomotives in total, began their withdrawal from mainline service. The last active unit, Y6b number 2190, completed its final revenue run in 1960, making Norfolk and Western the last major American railroad to operate steam in regular freight service. There was no farewell ceremony, no commemorative plaque was installed at Roanoke Shops. The locomotives that had carried millions of tons of coal through the Appalachians moved to sidings, then to storage tracks, then to the cutting torch. Of the 30 Y6b locomotives, not one was preserved. Not a single example stands in a museum. Not one carries a serial number in a preservation catalog. The Virginia Museum of Transportation holds a builder's photograph. The Norfolk and Western Historical Society maintains specification sheets. But the machines themselves, everyone, were scrapped between 1960 and 1962. The contrast with Big Boy's survival is not accidental, it is instructive. Union Pacific's decision to preserve 8 Big Boy locomotives was deliberate and institutional. The railroad's public relations department had spent 2 decades cultivating the locomotive's legend. Press tours, photo specials, and model train licensing had embedded Big Boy into popular consciousness. When dieselization came, Union Pacific's leadership understood that these machines were cultural assets as much as mechanical ones. Preservation was framed as stewardship of the national railroad heritage, and it generated positive coverage, public goodwill, and a lasting association between Union Pacific's brand and American industrial greatness. Norfolk and Western operated under a different calculus. The railroad's identity was built around operational efficiency, not spectacle. Its machines were tools refined over decades for a specific purpose, evaluated by cost per ton-mile rather than newspaper headlines. When those tools were superseded, the institutional logic that had governed their creation applied equally to their disposal. Scrap value was real. Storage costs were real. The public relations value of an 8-axle compound articulated locomotive standing in a field outside Roanoke was, to the man who ran the numbers, essentially zero. Museum partners in Virginia, approached in the final months before scrapping, found themselves unable to arrange transport or funding quickly enough. A machine weighing nearly 500,000 pounds, sitting on track not connected to any heritage line, required more than goodwill to move. The logistical cost exceeded what any preservation organization of the era could mobilize in time. And so, the Y6b vanished entirely. 30 locomotives reduced to raw tonnage on a scrap market that did not care what their tractive effort had been. The official record leaves no ambiguity. 30 Y6 bye-bye locomotives were built at the Roanoke Shops. 30 were retired, 30 were scrapped. Builder specification sheets confirmed the 152,206-pound tractive effort figure. Operational logs confirmed the sustained performance in coal service. Historical Society archives confirmed the maintenance economics, and every scrap manifest confirms the same conclusion: nothing survived. The question that follows from those documents is not technical, it is philosophical. If the measure of a locomotive's greatness is the single metric most commonly cited, the force it could apply at the rail to start a heavy train, then the American record holder is not the machine in the museum. It is the machine in the scrapyard. That inversion should trouble anyone who treats the preservation record as a reliable guide to engineering history. What the Y6b's absence reveals is that collective memory about industrial achievement is not curated by engineers. It is curated by publicity departments, preservation budgets, museum acquisition committees, and the accident of which institutions happen to have the space, the funding, and the institutional will to act before the cutting torch arrived. The big boy endures not because it was definitively superior by every measure, but because Union Pacific decided its legend was worth maintaining and had the resources to act on that decision. 8 big boys survive in museums from coast to coast. 0 Y6b locomotives remain anywhere on Earth. The number 152,206 appears in archive specification sheets that most visitors to those museums have never seen. Legacy, as the archives quietly insist, is not written in steel. It is written in decisions about which steel deserves to last. Today, as debates continue about what industrial history is worth preserving, which factories, which machines, which engineering lineages, the Y6b's disappearance offers a precise case study. The most powerful pulling machine in American steam history left no physical trace. It exists only in documents, in photographs, and in the operational logs of a railroad that measured everything in cost per ton-mile and found no line item for posterity. The threshold for greatness, it turns out, is not a number in a specification sheet. It is whether anyone decided the number was worth remembering. What other records are sitting in archives right now attached to machines we already melted down?